Okay, so it's my privilege today to have Chris Caterine, PhD. He's the author of Leaving Academia, A Practical Guide, which came out in September. So Chris currently serves as a proposal writer and communications strategist for a global consulting firm working with technical experts, account leads, and graphic designers to win high-value contracts. Prior to this, he spent a decade in higher education as an advocate for contingent faculty and a professor of Roman literature and history. He holds a PhD in classics from the University of Virginia. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really great to have you. And I just finished the book as I told you. I've been reading through it the last few days, and I really enjoyed it. It's a really great read, and I really enjoyed it too as somebody who went through a similar process and found my own way and found a career with my degree. And it was neat. Like, I was trying to see it from somebody's perspective as they stand at the other side of this journey, or from my perspective before I started. And it was really neat, though, too, to see it from the other side and how much it resonated with me at different points. There are a lot of different points that I found a lot of reflections in my own journey. So I really loved the book. I really enjoyed it, both in terms of, like, it was really easy to read and chock full of good stuff, but it was also had lots of, like, really solid research in it and a lot of facts. And to be honest, I think I had known some of the facts about academia, but you raised a lot of things that I didn't actually know, especially like in the first chapter when you talk about kind of how bad it is. I think you had some of, like, the newer research, and some of it I hadn't seen yet. And I mean, academia is bad, but when you really get into it, you really just you really kind of laid out how bad things are. So anyways, not to stay there, because we're not going to have a sad interview about how bad academia is. But to get us started, I wonder if maybe, and recognizing probably not everybody watching this has had a chance to read the book yet, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey as an academic, and kind of we'll start there and kind of move forward with your journey a bit, and then talk about some of the parts of the book. So who is Chris the academic?
Yeah, Chris the academic was a Greco-Roman classicist. So I studied the literature of the Greeks and Romans, ancient material. And I focused in particular on how historiographical authors, so authors of historical texts, influence their readers' thinking about the past and their understanding about the past. And in particular, I looked at how different emotions are provoked by historical texts. And my dissertation was actually written about a long narrative poem about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey that led to the fall of the Republic by a 25-year-old friend of the Emperor Nero, who was made to commit suicide after being implicated in a plot to kill the king. So wow. It's sort of a wild, insane poem. I basically spent my days really leaning hard into deep philological analysis. So trying to understand how the words on the page feed into broader themes within the poem, and then how those influence the reader into thinking whatever it is that the author wanted them to think about the past that was part of their culture.
And you, as you kind of talk about in the book, like, you were one of those people like me as well, who you didn't expect to leave academia, right?
No, I was way too arrogant to think that I would ever leave academia. I was really convinced that, I could outwork or outsmart enough people that the statistics didn't matter. And I think you could have told, 21, 22-year-old Chris, only 7% of people who enter grad school get those tenure track jobs that you think you're after. And I would have said, well, yeah, but I'm going to be one of the 7%. And I would have believed it. Yeah. Yeah.
And you chased the dream for a while. It wasn't, it took a little while to recognize that academic job wasn't coming. So can you tell us a little bit about what your kind of post-PhD life looked like at first, when you were still kind of had your mind set on academia? And I know also it involved your spouse as well, and you guys were kind of navigating that together.
Yeah, my wife Mallory got a job at Tulane in New Orleans, where she still teaches, in 2013. She began that fall, right after we got married, actually. And so we came down here, never having been to New Orleans, thinking that we would really only be here for 9 months before one of us got a tenure track job. And that really was the belief. So during that year, I was finishing my dissertation. When I was done, she had not secured a tenure track position, and neither had I. And the department had a visiting assistant professorship opening that I was able to secure. I suspect because I was, they were viewing it as a spousal hire, even though I did have to go through an interview process and all that. So they made me think I wasn't going to get it necessarily, although I did. And then I taught in that position for 3 years, and I was teaching a course on Roman history, 2 sections of it every semester, and then 1 course that would rotate on top of that. So I was, publishing an article, thinking about how to revise my dissertation as a monograph, really looking forward to a true academic scholarly career. Things really changed for me and for my wife when she was actually offered a tenure track position at a small school in the U.S. Midwest that was just a bad fit for the two of us as a couple, for us as a family, and for her as an individual as well. And in the course of coming to that decision that she was going to turn down the job, as we had these conversations together, one of the things that shifted in our conception of work was that we went from thinking about how bad does a job have to be to turn it down, which is how we entered that process, and this job met that threshold. And we started thinking about how good would a job have to be for us to leave New Orleans. And we'd only been here for 18 months, but we'd really fallen in love with the city. And once you start asking, how good does a job have to be to uproot my life, that bar is actually a lot higher than we expected it to be. And so from there, I sort of began this process of exploring other careers. It started, I guess it was spring 2015. And I didn't actually end up getting my current position until I began in August 2017. So there was about a 2.5-year period there where I was exploring other things. But that's sort of how it started. And again, I came at it as somebody who was really quite committed to being a professor and rising through the academic ranks that way.
Wow. Okay. I'm just gonna try and turn my video on here one more time. We'll see. We'll keep our fingers crossed, and so just to those watching, we've just had some internet issues. So worst case scenario, you can just watch Chris, but otherwise maybe you can watch both of us too. So it makes it a little easier to have a conversation if you're not just talking at the screen. So no, that's really great. And one of the things, really great. What I was going to say is what struck me about all this as I was reading the book, and especially with the with turning down that particular position, is you really highlight well the actual lack of agency that we have as academics, and the amount of times that we're just willing to just believe that we don't get any say in the work we do, that the place we live, all these types of things. Could you talk a little bit about that and the role that kind of maybe your evolving view of that agency, and also just what it was like to turn down that position? Yeah. So apologies to everybody who's watching this. We've just had a few technical difficulties with Zoom and the internet, and we're not quite sure what, but we're going to keep going here, and hopefully the situation gets a little better. So so I was asking about the question of agency. How often, as academics, we just kind of take it for granted that somebody else will choose where we live, the type of work we'll be doing, and just kind of based on a few very, very slim options. And you write about this in the book really well. And I was just asking you to reflect on it a little bit.
That period of time for us was like really intense therapy, in the sense that we were having these discussions as we're driving back and forth between this college town and the nearest minor city, and really talking about what was getting us excited about academic work, what would be good about this position for my wife, what might be good about it for me, if there were any redeeming qualities in this place that we were talking about living. And the thing that sticks out in my mind is I remember driving back from the city to the town one day. It was about a 75-minute drive, and we were talking, and the conversation was turning to, like, how could you bring Greco-Roman literature to impoverished kids in New Orleans, and wouldn't it be really interesting to run a program doing that? And I was saying, and at the end of it, I was just thinking, wait a minute, we're in this place trying to think forward to a life where we live in the Midwest, not in New Orleans, but our conversation is still going back there. And there were just all these little warning lights that kept coming up and saying, wait a minute, no, this isn't a good choice. When my wife was was on her on-campus interview, and it was a religious school, and she went to chapel. She got a migraine when she was in chapel, and she just said, "Well, if that's not a sign, I don't really know what else is." And it's really hard. What was this process like? It was just like 1,000 epiphanies that hit over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. That as much as we thought we were supposed to want to be at this tenure track position, or that she was supposed to want to be in the tenure track position, it didn't make sense for her. It didn't make sense, moving there didn't make sense for me, because there was nothing else around that I could do. They dangled a spousal hire in front of me at one point, which we discussed. And I met with the dean about that, and he said, "Well, it's going to be half-time employment for 1 year, and then we'll see." And I said, "Well, that's not a spousal hire. That's you trying to get me up here on the cheap as an adjunct."
Spousal adjunct position, yeah.
It is, and then it's a bait and switch, really, because we all know what the budget is going to do the next year. So there were just all of these signs saying, no, this is a bad idea. But we've been acculturated over the course of a decade just to fight those instincts. And I say that this was like a really intensive therapy session, because it forced us to reconsider all of these really fundamental assumptions that we were making about how we had to live. And coming out of that, it just became a lot easier to prioritize things and to make decisions, because we said, okay, well, we don't want to live apart. We know that. We don't want to leave New Orleans in the short term, at least. So we know that. And if I can't get a job at a university here, then the obvious solution is for me to look for a new career, her position being non-tenure track, but renewable. So that's really how it happened. But it was a really challenging period. And I don't know if the full degree of the angst that we were experiencing really comes across in those pages, but it was painful. It really was. And even after we made the decision jointly, we were not sure that we made the right one. And there were people telling us that that was sort of career suicide, which it hasn't been for either one of us. But that was a real fear.
That's really something. And I can imagine the angst. And I mean, on a personal level, I was reflecting on my journey as well. And my wife's not an academic, but we had a similar we moved back to our parents' basement after. And before that, we had this kind of similar journey of like, maybe we're going to go here, maybe we're going to go here. But I didn't have an on-campus interview or anything, but it was still the possibilities, and then having to kind of let that die is really hard. And the other thing that I resonated with as a religious studies scholar is that the description of that small campus was really interesting to me, because a lot of the jobs that I could apply for, I was limited by ideology, so that I had to kind of match an ideology, religious studies, especially I did kind of ancient studies and some biblical studies. So often there are a lot of professors that go into small schools with like statement of faith and that sort of thing. And then they end up kind of holding their breath and signing something, and then they end up getting fired, or even tenure track professors fired for violating it later on. So it's a really some of those like ideological contours were really interesting too, and I was reflecting a lot on that as I was reading.
It's funny you mentioned that, because this was a school that did have a faith pledge that you had to sign if you were hired. And when the two of us went up for my wife's first interview, she went up by herself, obviously. But then when we were considering this, we went up together. And we were invited to lead some discussion sections in a class. And I think they must have been reading the Antigone. And we were kind of leading separate groups, but the professor had asked us to do it, so that's fine. And just in the course of walking students through some basic issues in the Antigone, independent of one another, we both seemed to spark a crisis of faith for some of the students. We said, okay, well, at a school like this, if that happens when you have 20 minutes with a few students, what is the likelihood for my wife that she could pass a tenure review? It's just low. Yeah. So it was a worrisome indicator. And that was one of the things, again, that just said, this is not a good fit for us, right? Yeah, and that doesn't mean it's a bad fit for everybody. There are people who are happy and comfortable teaching that environment, and that could be a good job for them, but that wasn't us.
Hmm. So you decided to kind of strike out, and obviously the story's too long to tell, and we'll have to leave it as a teaser that people have to go buy the book if they want to read the whole story. But can you give a little bit of a kind of an overview of what your journey out of academia looked like and what it entailed?
In the spring of 2015, after the incident we just spoke about, I was really apprehensive about leaving, but felt it was something that I had to do. So I quietly began a few informational interviews with people adjacent to the scholarly world. So basically, university administrators, both at Tulane, where I was teaching at the time, and at Loyola University of New Orleans, which is right next door. And I think I had maybe 4 or 5 discussions to see if there were any kind of on-campus roles that might be an easy fit. And what I told myself was that I was going to spend, a month having those conversations, thinking through it, and then I would return to my scholarship for that summer and fall and have one last outing on the academic job market. And if that didn't go well, then I would call it. That year was sort of infamous in classical studies because usually there are an awful lot of jobs for Latin literature and Latin poetry in particular, kind of all the subspecialties. That's the one that does okay, and that was my area. And that year there was not a single job in my subspecialty. And I said, okay, well, I'm glad I started thinking about this, but it's time to begin looking elsewhere. And so that brings us to winter 2016. Spring 2016. So I began really trying to re-engage with university administrators that spring. Didn't have much luck. It was in the late spring, early summer of 2016 that I met a guy named Andrew Foley. And I noticed Andrew on the website of a local consulting firm, and he had a master's in music from Johns Hopkins and had been pursuing PhD work, but now he was in this consultancy. And I said, I need to meet this guy, and it seemed sort of forward, but I just sent a note to the info at site and said, hey, can you put me in touch with this guy? And later that afternoon, he called me to set up time to have drinks and chat. And he put me in touch with, I think, 5 people he knew in town. And that really kickstarted my informational interviews with people in business. And once I saw that there was somebody with a background similar to mine who'd really been committed to the academic life, committed to humanistic study in particular, who then was going and doing pretty serious business, that really got me excited, made me think that it was something that I could do and actually enjoy. And that really did kickstart what became a basically 1-year process of just meeting as many people as I could, taking night classes, throwing myself into as many new experiences as I could to build experience, build skills. And eventually it was through networking again that I got a foot in the door with my current company and was able to land the job that I hold now.
It's really one of the things that struck me about the book, and I mean, you do kind of devote time to both resume writing and the informational interview kind of networking side of things. But I mean, it's no secret if anyone's read the Roostervane blog that I'm very, very, very heavy on the informational interview networking side and very light on the resume side. So I really obviously I enjoyed both, and they're both really important to have as you rightly point out in the book. But I perked up at the way that informational interviews kind of transformed your life, and because it was similar for me again, and it's one of the reasons why I became so kind of committed to telling people that they need to do this, because that was really what made the difference for me. So what would you say to somebody who's kind of looking at leaving and is maybe, I do talk to people who have edited their resume 47 times and have sent it out 300 times, but have never quite had the courage, can I say, without being too, I don't mean to kind of put anybody down, but never cross that threshold to going and sitting down with a stranger and asking them about what they do. What would you say to them?
Well, first, I used to be like that too. And I remember taking 30 minutes to write an email to ask my dissertation advisor for a 15-minute meeting. It's just a terrible use of time. But that's how introverted and shy I really was. So to go from that to being willing to send an email to the info at a website and ask for a meeting, it was quite a change for me. I think academics often get into this habit of rewriting the resume because, you've done your CV and it seems like if you just spend more time on something, you should be able to get to a breakthrough. Mm-hmm. As a communication strategist, though, one of the things that I am keen to remind people is that until you know who your audience is, you can't really know what your message is going to be. Mm-hmm. And so all of this work polishing a resume is to my mind, I don't want to say useless, but it's a wasted effort because you're not putting time into the right sort of thing until you know who you're speaking to, what they value, how they think, and until you have a decent grasp on how you can frame your experience and your skill sets mm-hmm. and the methodologies that you apply in your work to the problems that matter to them.
Yeah.
So to my mind, informational interviews are just a much more efficient way of learning the culture and the language of a new sector, of a new industry, of a new company, so that when they ask for a resume, you're not just giving them what you think is important, but you can actually include the details that they think are important. And that's actually how you communicate well, is you need to start with them. And I'll add that this is a place where people coming out of the humanities should be especially strong, because most of us do cultural history in one shape or another, and we tend to be very good at looking at other people with different ideas and mental frameworks and figuring out how those work and putting ourselves into their shoes without losing our own sense of identity. Mm-hmm. And so I think in a sense you can approach informational interviewing like a miniature sociological experiment where you're trying to learn what is the language of these people, how do they think, what do they value, what is this society, what is this culture, and you don't need to buy into it all. You may choose to buy into some of it, but if you go about it that way, you'll learn what you need to say to get them to listen. And at a certain point, it is on you to convince them that what you do has value, not for them to get the PhD that you got to see why they should care.
It's funny. My first thought was to make a clever remark about counting a philologist to focus on the importance of language, but I totally agree. It's really, really true, and it's ironic that like when I came to Ottawa and ended up working in policy, I mean, I didn't even know the word policy. I didn't know, and a lot of the words that people use, I mean, I probably heard it in the news, but I didn't actually know what a policy analyst did. And there are so many of those times, I think, and in informational interviews is really where it comes across that somebody's describing a job and they're saying, yeah, in my career, we do stakeholder relations or something like that. And when you stop and listen to what they're describing, you say to yourself, yeah, that's like, I could do that. And I've just never actually called it that. Right. And that's again, you bring this out really well in the book, but when you can make that leap between, it's not even about developing new skills in this case. It's just about like properly naming the skills that you do have, I think.
Yeah. And realizing that proper naming depends on context. Yeah. And the first thing you need to do is learn that context. And you can only do that if you go out and talk to people. And, I've had people push me on this and say, well, you can hire a good, resume consultant to help you make that jump. And, okay, if you have the money to do that, good for you. I didn't. So, okay, fine. But also I would say that if somebody has shaped your resume for you, that's fine. But when it comes time for an actual interview, a job interview, you're still not going to know how to talk to these people. And so informational interviews are also useful as a sort of training ground for you to practice what versions of your story resonate with different types of people, to get used to modifying on the fly, and just to get comfortable having a conversation that isn't about the details of what you study.
Yep. And I loved this. You just, what you just said made me think of something else in the book that I really enjoyed. And it was this idea of telling your story, but also evolving your story and getting better at telling your story. Because I know, and you really do a nice job of this in the book by talking about this kind of big sob story you had about academia, right? That you were telling people. And I had somebody, it was a similar thing. It didn't happen to me, but happened to a friend of mine. And somebody had actually told them, pardon my language, but somebody said, like, nobody gives a shit about that. So it was a really funny way for this individual that, like, they were telling everybody this story about academia is so bad and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I don't want, and I wanted to be a professor and now I can't. So what do I do now? And it was a real wake up call for this person. And it sounds like it was kind of a similar thing for you too, as you describe it, to first of all, refine that message and get better at what you're saying. But also don't make it seem like the person you're talking to, that their life would be a consolation prize for you, right? Like that you're actually interested.
Exactly. Yeah, that's such a good way to put it. And it's funny. I tell that story in the book where I basically just fell flat explaining why I was changing careers. And what's really funny is there have been a handful of times where I've wanted to reach back out to that person with to introduce them to somebody who might be really useful to their career, or to, in one case, I had I was briefly on the finance board of a nonprofit, and I thought that individual could have been a really helpful person for the executive director to get in touch with. And she didn't answer the introduction emails in large part because I clearly hadn't made a good impression. And I think everybody should realize that you are going to have a couple of informational interviews that don't go well, and that's okay. But one of the reasons why you do want them to go well is because there may be times in the future where it's not even that you want help from that person, but where somebody who needs help could benefit from them, and you want to be that conduit to put them in touch to help solve that problem. And if you come at networking and relationship building with that lens of wanting to be somebody who helps other people resolve problems faster and with less expense, that is a recipe for success.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny. And I mean, I know often like PhDs in that position don't think that they have anything to offer. And I've told the story about when I was searching, I had made a meeting with somebody who was kind enough to give me a meeting. And then in the month in between our meeting, I got hired for a think tank, and I was running a project that all of a sudden he or she wanted to be on. No, he wanted to be on. So he at that point was emailing me and saying, "Can I be involved? Can I do this? Can I do?" And it's funny how quickly that dynamic can change, and you think of yourself as this person with your hat in your hand, but really once you kind of, and I think people know this networking. I know this about students, right? That you never know where you're going to be in a year or 5 years, and it's always worth a chance to have a conversation with somebody. And I like to tell people networking isn't strictly transactional, but at the same time, don't feel like you have nothing to offer either, right?
Yeah, and even if you think you have nothing to offer, if you are meeting with 2 people a week in your community, in about 6 weeks, you have just a lot of nodes out there that are kind of more contact points, and it doesn't take that long to have a pretty sizable network of people who could help one another, and it snowballs really, really fast.
Yeah. And it's a learned skill as well, as you say. Like, I think that I was interviewing Carrie Brubaker a few weeks ago, who had worked in pharma, and she kind of said exactly that, the first few networking meetings might be kind of crap. Like, you might not, say the right things, or you might feel like whatever, and but you get better at it. You get more comfortable. As you say, you rehearse your story, you understand the nuances of that kind of communication a little more. And as time goes on, you're going to improve. It's just a question of putting in the time and actually doing the legwork to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't be afraid to fail. And, you're, like I said, you're going to have bad meetings. Everybody will. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're all going to be like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to pull out a few things from the book that I thought were really interesting and really resonated, and kind of pitch them to you maybe for some comment or discussion. So first of all, I don't know if I have discussion on this, but this jumped out at me. I think you were quoting somebody, but I didn't write down who it was. But the quote was, "All faculty are contingent, even if some don't like to realize it." Yeah.
That was a friend of mine from the world of classics who said that. I worked with him on, and I don't name him, so it's not that you missed it. I blinded it, so he doesn't get bothered. But I worked with him on contingent faculty issues with the Society for Classical Studies, and this was a quip of his, and he said. And he'd spent some time outside of academia before coming back, actually. And he said, once you realize just how dependent so many universities, especially in the US, are on tuition, all it takes is, as we've seen, unfortunately, a pandemic for a few of them to start closing. And tenure is pretty worthless at that point. The moment the university needs to shutter for financial reasons, that is not actually job protection. So and that was another thing that weighed on us, me and my wife, that is, in thinking about that position she was offered, is that it was a small school in a rural area that was heavily tuition dependent. And in the area, the demographics were basically leading to a rapidly shrinking number of 18 to 22-year-olds. So you look at that and say, well, what are the odds that they decide to scrap the classics department? It could be high. So if that happens, that's it. And I think that, there is this allure of the tenure track job, which is lifetime job security. But the moment you realize that that's probably only going to hold at major state institutions in the U.S., government funded institutions, which I guess is most of them in Canada, or some of the really established private schools here, that's it. And for those people, the number is not 7% get a tenure track job. The number is 3% get a tenure track job at NOR1. And that's just a bad, it's really bad odds.
Yeah. And I think, so a couple more things kind of in this realm that struck me. One was, you were telling David Engel's story. You kind of say they loved academia and loved to drink wine and hang out with professors, and came to realize that, it's easy for philosophers to say that money didn't matter because some of these people had the privilege of having some, but it's a different story when you don't have any, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as David has said, he was one of those people who didn't have to worry about it. And so that was sort of okay for him. But then all of a sudden he realized that maybe he did care about money and wanted a lifestyle that could afford different or better things. And so he pursued it, and he's been quite a bit happier since.
Yeah, that's great. And then kind of in this vein, because I had to write this down because it was so good. I've never really had a way to explain this to people, and I'm gonna use this because you raise the point really. So on this theme of money, and often people think about like evil corporations or the evil corporate world. And we have these really, and I think I'm even guilty of this because I often say like, oh, if you want to go work for a job, or maybe if you just want to go work for a nonprofit and do some good in the world, that kind of thing. And you really rightly point out that the structures of an individual organization, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit, is not necessarily an indicator of the type of good or bad that it does, because there are oil lobbyists that are nonprofits, and there are really great kind of corporations that are doing really good kind of socially conscious kind of work. Can you talk a little bit about that, and like where you think about like, or how we delineate like good versus bad work, and kind of what you've learned about that?
That is a challenging and personal question.
Okay.
And so I don't want to make too many categorical statements because people's politics will differ, and what they are willing to accept as good work will vary. And I don't want to cut off any of those options, because at a certain point, what matters is that you find work that you are comfortable doing.
I did just disparage the oil lobbies. So sorry about that.
Well, and but there are oil foundations that are actually putting money towards good humanistic causes, and so that's some of that money does come back to good places, and it's on you as an individual to decide whether that's an okay trade-off. So that is. It's a big and tough question. And I get into this in the second chapter about discernment, that those are some of the things that you will need to decide for yourself. And as I think through this, the section that you're talking about does come later, where I break down these distinctions. But I do think it's part of that broader discussion or discernment that you need to have about where do you draw those lines? But yeah, these days there are an awful lot of companies that are structured as for-profit ventures, but have a mission that is driven towards social good, but they want to be able to access venture capital money instead of grants, and that just lets them act differently. I mean, you mentioned the oil lobbyists. They could be nonprofits. The Trump organization or the foundation was a nonprofit. The Clinton Foundation was a nonprofit. Wherever you want to go politically, those things may or may not have been doing good. And even that's a non-answer. I'm sorry. It's interesting. Completely, but I do think it's worth thinking through.
it's some of the things that I'm thinking through as well. And even one of the things that I still kind of think through and maybe struggle with a little bit is that even for companies that don't take venture capital money, but that actually take money from customers, that in a way that's not necessarily a bad thing, that you're serving people, and you're providing a good and you're taking money in return. And anyways, I've done my own kind of unpacking this, both in terms of like my upbringing and then kind of the lens that academia gave me to look at money. So this is a whole different different conversation.
And I mean, you can also look at things like sustainability and diversity and inclusion, and businesses have different records on those things too. And sometimes it is just about a PR stunt to look good for the issue of the day. But other times there are companies that are deeply interested in making profit, but doing so in a way that doesn't harm the environment, or that does funnel as much money as possible to diverse contractors or suppliers. And that can be really good. And I can't get into details of my work now, but I've seen a number of times where large household name corporations have been doing things like that in ways that are really meaningful.
Yeah.
And that's also, really allowed me to appreciate the ways in which even companies that you might think of as being kind of faceless corporate entities interested in profit only are really driving major change, because they actually have the scale to do it in a way that an individual does not.
Yeah, no, it's really, and I think frankly, one of the things I've often thought is that a lot of our ideas, especially within the academy, our ideas about business come from like movies like Office Space in the 1990s, and things like that, that like these, or The Office, the show The Office. And there are certainly workplaces that look like that, but there's also, like here in Ottawa, we have Shopify, which is, I don't know if it's the biggest company in Canada. It's one of the biggest anyways. Certainly the biggest in terms of market cap. And it's just this fantastic company where they have beanbag chairs, and it's a cool culture, but at the same time, they've got, I don't know if you know, like following the executives on LinkedIn or anything, but there's a lot of them with just really fantastic social visions, and really, like, they're just doing really good stuff. And a lot of people, I think, would be shocked to kind of know that a lot of the way we think about, just the way we think about non-academic work in general, are a lot of just assumptions about what based on movies we've seen, and never even having stepped foot in a non-academic office, right?
Well, and I think the same holds of the academy, right? Most of your ideas about what it's going to be like to be a professor are based on your impressions of what professors did when you were 18 to 22. Yeah. And then you sort of feel it out in grad school and think it's different. And then you get there and realize, oh my God, I've never actually asked somebody what this job is.
Yeah.
And informational interviewing could be valuable inside the academy as well, for people to see if being a professor is actually a job that you want. Yeah. I think if I had done that, I might have found out a lot sooner that it actually wasn't.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so I want to move on from this, but there's more. There's so much we could talk about, but I want to
talk about this all day. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. I don't want to use all your time up, but sometime I'll come down to New Orleans, and we'll have a beer, and we can chat all this through. I have to say, it's not New Orleans though. How do you say it?
New Orleans. Yeah, you got it.
No, I mean,
some people will say New Orleans.
Okay.
Anybody who says Nolans is lying to you about its pronunciation.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. So there you go. Okay, so I wanted to ask about this idea. I love this, and I wrote it down, and it resonated with me so much that when you were in academia, you believed that being single-minded in devotion to academia would lead you to be a successful, serious scholar. And you didn't have any other outside interests. At least this is true for me as well. And this belief that if I just focus on this and don't even think about anything else and don't have any fun and don't, that I will be successful. And it just resonated with me so much. And then also, I think, which sounds like it was true of you too, it made the exit that much more difficult, because I didn't have any other friends. I didn't have any other interests. I didn't have any hobbies. I was just thinking about academia all the time. And it made life a little tricky on the other side. So could you talk a bit about that? It's a really interesting observation.
That really is the biggest issue. And I think this ties back to the informational interviews and why they're so important. It's another way of just learning how to talk to people. I did end up picking up a hobby at the very end of grad school. I began brewing my own beer. And when I came to New Orleans, I got plugged into a local homebrew club where I was speaking with these like old libertarian white guys who had been doing it since before it was legal in the US, like off the grid types, and then a bunch of hipsters, which was a really weird mix of people all in one room, sharing beer. But, they by and large didn't care about what I was doing with ancient literature. They wanted to talk about beer. And so, you got some of that experience. But yeah, all through grad school, I was really convinced that I wouldn't be serious if I was doing anything else. And there were stories that grad students told. I still don't know if they're true or not, but about faculty, calling people in for a serious chat about whether they were serious about their studies for teaching like a cooking class once a week and things like this. Wow. And so there was this culture, at least where I was studying, that said, hey, serious means doing nothing else. And one of the things that I've come to realize since leaving academia is just how much worse of a scholar that made me. Because when I wasn't talking to anybody outside of the field of classics, I became incapable of seeing through the trees in the forest, or seeing the forest for the trees. And so I could only ever tell people about the details of what I was studying. I couldn't tell anybody why it mattered. And I couldn't even explain to myself why it mattered. And so my scholarship took a very long time to do and to write. And, I gave some presentations that were okay, but not terribly impactful. And I really do believe that if I had spent more time in grad school not doing grad school, I would have been able to see the importance of what I was studying, or at least to distill it in a way that was more helpful, probably 75% faster.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I think was so personally hard in my exit from academia, was looking back on my undergrad and my grad school years and saying, oh my God, I wasted so much time. And it wasn't that I wasted time in the sense that I wish that I hadn't done it, because I'm happy that I did it and it made me who I am. And I don't think I would change that, but I would certainly change how little attention I gave to outside activities and to viewing myself as a complete person rather than a classics robot.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think, like, for me personally, it made me remarkably selfish, I think, in that I was, even in the context of my program and department, I was so fixated on things that would progress my career prospects or progress my CV that I actually said no to a lot of, just going out for beer with colleagues, or just or organizing a conference or something like that. And ironically, on the job front, that also held me back, because I didn't, as you say in the book, that a lot of times the stuff in that service section of your CV is actually the most useful for taking you outside of the academy, because you've organized something, you've managed a project, you've created an event or whatever it is. And that can be often when people send me their CVs and they want to make them into a resume, I say, put all that stuff up top, because often that's the best stuff in there.
Yeah.
I didn't have it. I was just so kind of selfishly obsessed with getting the academic job and just getting rid of things that took up time that didn't rank as highly.
Yeah. I remember when I was prepping for my first academic interview, one of the things that my faculty kept saying about all the grad students is, you need to stop thinking of yourself as a grad student and start thinking of yourself as a colleague. And I was thinking, well, okay, but I have no practice doing that. I don't know. I don't even know what that means, actually, because I've never been there. And that really puts you in a bind. And my wife went to Princeton, which was I'll say a less conservative program, as surprising as that might be, than Virginia was at the time. And, she was on a first name with her faculty. She was really treated, I think all those students were treated as equals from the day they came onto campus, age 22 or however older. And that just wasn't the case. I was very much viewed as a student in my program. And the difference in how I saw her colleagues conduct themselves professionally and how I conducted myself and how I saw my colleagues conducting themselves, my fellow students, it was really jarring. And that was something that was always this point of tension as I was going through grad school. I just felt like I knew there was something missing, and yet I was being told I had to just drill down and keep doing what I was doing, reading Latin and Greek. And that was Yeah, I regret not pushing back against that more than I did.
Hmm. So we're kind of I want to wrap this up. There's one last thing I want to ask you about, and this is a really good natural segue, I think. Ego. You talk a lot in the book about ego. So what have you learned about ego, and both in academia and outside of academia?
Ego. I have a lot of it. I still do. I think
Me too.
you don't you don't write a book if you don't have ego. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But I think ego really blinded me to so much. And the problem with ego is that it leads you to believe that your assumptions are fact. And it leads you to believe that you don't need to find an outside check on your assumptions. And so the things that you believe about corporate life in America because of Office Space or The Office or whatever else just become real to you, or the things you believe about how good the academy is become real to you, even if reality doesn't map onto that. Yeah. And I think a lot of the disillusionment that people feel when they get into academic careers has to do with that discrepancy. And I suspect that ego is part of that for a lot of people, because you just refuse to believe that somebody else's experience or collection of evidence could actually be right and apply to you. And so that's the other thing about informational interviews is that they are essentially a way to rapidly get more information that comes from somebody outside of yourself and your assumptions. And you need to break down those assumptions as quick as you can. Of course, once you get into a new job and get settled in, new assumptions will be built back up, and you need to be disciplined, I think, about continuing to break them down, to keep doing informational interviews, to keep networking. You don't need to do it straight away necessarily. You still want to learn your job and get good at it once you get one. Yeah. But if you stop, if you get back into that habit of thinking that you know all the answers and can solve all the problems and don't need to consult with anybody else, you're just going to find yourself in the same position. Yeah. And, I'm 3 years on into my post-academic life now. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns or fears that I have still moving forward, is I don't want to get stuck again. And I want to make sure that I'm constantly growing and seeking the best possible opportunities that I can find for myself within the context that I operate in. And that's a challenge. And
Yeah, no, and I was going to say probably paying it forward as well, which is where you end your book, that with a call to those who have gone through the transformation to pay it forward to those who are just starting. And I think that's a really great place to end the book. And it was, it just made me think that a lot of, for you too, I'm sure it's the truth, that a lot more of my service and my networking, kind of quote unquote networking now, is done more with where I'm in the position where I, know something and somebody's, wanting to ask me questions. And that's really rewarding too. It's fantastic to be on the other side and to be able to help somebody else who was in the shoes that I was once in.
Absolutely. And I, as you say, I mean, that is why I wrote the book, was to do a lot of that, to pay it forward. And I'm happy that I've done so. And that I've been able to create this resource that can perpetuate that. But that doesn't mean that I can't look outside myself again. Because if I put myself into that role as the expert who has all the answers, I'm just right back where I started, which is not where you want to be.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the book is Leaving Academia, a Practical Guide. Ideally, I'd be holding it up right now, but I read it on my phone. I downloaded it on Kindle, so I don't have the hard copy. But Chris Caterine, where can people get the book, I should ask?
You can get it from Princeton University Press. It's also available on Amazon.
All right. Chris, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you for spending this time.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Okay, we'll talk soon.